So now we are going to week 5, and we are heading into several major events. We're talking about world wars and the Cold War, and then kind of spilling into the idea of the war on terror. So listen, I think this section really helps you kind of look at the Western world and the context that we're in. And for those of you who are younger, meaning that you weren't really around conceptually anyways to think about politics or history during the Cold War, this is very important for you to watch and to understand. When Obama was being called a socialist by his opponents, for young people this seems just, I mean, most of them didn't even find this as an insult. They didn't even really get it. But it was an older generation that mainly that were not happy with Obama. To call him a socialist was a pejorative term because socialism was associated with communism, or if you even called him a communist or a Marxist. I can tell you right now that he was not. Just to clarify, and Obamacare is actually forcing the U.S. government to put pressure on the private sector, on insurance companies. It is not single payer, it is not socialist medicine, it is not socialist. Democrats tend to support social programs which have a socialistness to them, so that's true, and you can say that. Now, anyways, my whole point is that this debate and this anger about socialism that we have here, that is so strong in our culture, and it was such a big deal that Bernie Sanders was even saying the S word, saying I'm a democratic socialist, and I was like, whoa, who says that, in America? Well, in Europe, that's very normal. Europeans are relatively comfortable with those terms, and much more for a wider range of reasons, and one of the reasons is this, I'd argue, that when the Soviet Union existed, Europe had a lot of communist parties or other socialist parties, much more developed than here. And the Soviet Union, as you will learn, ends up going right through Eastern Europe at the end of the war and is in Eastern Germany, occupying it. And so it wasn't just a military threat, it was offering another alternative way of looking at politics and economics in the world. And as much as we now see so much of communism being discredited as this terrible place to live, and that our system, liberal democracy and capitalism is better, what they really didn't admit is that when capitalism failed, and it fails often, when there's a lot of poverty and you have a lot of problems, communism actually has a lot of appeal to it. And there was fear of it, winning over hearts and minds of people, despite the fact that many people also wanted to leave, and there were political dissidents in the West that were paraded on media stations to tell everybody, hey, look, it's really terrible over there. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of the socialism that was allowed in European countries was a kind of like defanging anything too radical, giving people just enough socialism to not have them seduced to go all the way into the Soviet sphere. Now, that's my interpretation through my studies. So again, what the Cold War has a major effect on the way that our politics, that this post-Soviet world has also been formed. And what I argue, and it's something that by the time you get to the end of this semester, you're getting so much information from me. There's one thing I want to drive home. I'm convinced that radical Islam, meaning the Al-Qaeda groups, ISIS, these kind of groups are the offshoot, the Frankenstein monster creation by the West of anti-communism in the Cold War. This is rooted in the Cold War, the period we're talking about. Now, why would I say that? And again, I might mention this in some other places, but I just want to drive this home to you. The United States liked Saudi Arabia not just for its oil, but for its radical Islam. Now, how would that be? When I say radical, meaning it's austere, it's puritanical, it's very strict form, it's passionate form. How would that be? Well, you had these competitive ideologies. What a lot of people don't realize, in the majority Muslim countries, people were looking to communism and nationalism and secularism, non-religious political ideologies, as a means for their society, and it was the West who dominated many of these countries, and they were looking to the Soviets to liberate them or to help support or as an alternative place to go. And so the United States was horrified by this, and Saudi Arabia was as well. And they didn't want these communist, atheistic ideologies permeating the region. And so the U.S. saw kind of promoting the agenda of Saudi Arabia as a way of actually buffering those other ideologies that would favor the Soviet sphere. You follow me on this? Okay, so southern Yemen actually went communist, and Afghanistan did also in the coup. Remember, that's also going to be something we have in the documentary to show. And the U.S. helped with Pakistan and with Saudi Arabia and other countries, unleashed on Afghanistan a lot of radical religious fundamentalist fighters to take on the communists. Not just the Russian invaders and occupiers, but the Afghans who sympathized with those in Afghanistan who sympathized with the secular ideology. And so then, the Soviet Union falls apart, and we have our whole world. We were supposed to see a world that everybody was like good from now on, but what we really see is capitalism now has to answer for its own mistakes. So how are they going to do that? In other words, you can't blame anything on the Soviet Union anymore. And this war on terror, war on communism makes sense. That's a real ideology. You have a war on communism. That's logically understandable in terms of what you're saying, whether you agree to that or not. War on terrorism is not logical. As one American official said, terrorism is a tactic. You don't have a war on a tactic. So now it's much more abstract. It's convoluted. Everything that we're dealing with now, and the complexities of being a U.S. president now, and trying to deal with the way we justify dominating the world now, as opposed to what we did then during the Cold War, is very different. So we could say, we're intervening everywhere in the world to justify putting a halt on communism. That was an easier sell, even when we were doing very controversial things, like supporting dictators that tortured and killed people, and we did on a regular basis. That's what we did, because it was still this Machiavellian idea of that the overall ends will justify the means. And that was what we did. So now, Soviet Union falls. Why are we still in Europe? Why are we still in throughout the Middle Eastern world, Latin America, and Asia? Well, there's North Korea. Okay, we got something there. Putin. Now, what's our relationship with Russia? It's a little. But it's a little bit more vague. You have to kind of articulate things a lot more. It's more complicated than before. If you feel what I'm saying. So this is all rooted in this time period. So what I'm trying to say is that in the middle of all the massive amount of information you're getting this week, if you can grasp just a little bit of it, you will be a little better informed as to all the dilemmas of modernity right now as we speak in this post-Soviet era. So anyways, that's all I have to say. If you have any questions or with anything, just call and let me know. I'll be go over some more things with you.